So a lot of my problems right now is I don't really have a brass ring, and I'm kind of open to suggestions about what what one chases. That the people who most interest me now are people who are older and who have sort of been through a midlife crisis. They tend to get weird because the normal incentives for getting out of bed don't tend to apply anymore. I have not found any satisfactory new ones, but I'm also not getting ready to, you know, jump off a building or anything.
Well, that's good
I
news.
was just thinking, it wasn't a chemical imbalance and it wasn't drugs and alcohol. I think it was much more that I lived an incredibly American life. This idea that if I could just achieve X and Y and Z, that everything would be okay. Feeling as though every axiom of your life turned out to be false and there was actually nothing. And it's all a delusion, and you're so much better than everybody because you can see that this is just a delusion, and you're so much worse because you can't fucking function. Good night.
Hey guys, hope everybody is doing alright out there. David Foster Wallace is a cult figure that I've been hearing, whose name and whose novel, Infinite Jest, main novel, I've been hearing about for years now. And I'll look up his Wikipedia real quickly. He's the guy that, appearance-wise, was known for wearing a bandana around his head, and I guess it was because he always sweat profusely. His legacy, well, I don't know a lot about him, so again, we're gonna tap into the theme of my channel, kind of discover on the go. So I never want to come across as an authority figure. I've been listening to a lot of his interviews, and he seems like such a, when you listen to him, you hear this deep melancholy in a person who's in deep despair, and to cut to the chase, he ultimately died a tragic death. He committed suicide, hung himself, and after, I think in his early 40s, after he was already a very established, well-known author. And Infinite Jest, I think he was only in his mid-30s when he published it. So, you know, he was writing it in his early 30s, maybe late 20s or something. I've never read the book. It's a very long book. It's over just over 1,000 pages. I've heard about it. He graduated in the late 80s from college, so he has a very strong theme of at least an influence of postmodernism, as far as I know. It got its name from just being distinguished from its type of writing out of which it emerged. It was the successor to modernism, and which is in itself heavily, I would say, heavily influenced by the industrialization of the world, the mechanization of the world. So if we look that up, and before I get too far into this, just so you guys know, a little disclaimer, this is going to be much more of a ramble. We're going to actually be reading his somewhat lengthy for a magazine publication called, what is it called, Shipping Out, on the parentheses nearly lethal and parentheses comforts of a luxury cruise by David Foster Wallace. I think the reason I want to talk about him and learn more about him is because he taps into the ennui, the sense of, essentially the sense of meaninglessness felt in a culture, and I think it stems from the fact that we're wealthy with a sense of guilt that we have to pay for being wealthy as a culture, as a general culture, and especially the affluent people within that culture, which is where I'm pretty sure he was the son of academics, at least. So if he wasn't extremely wealthy, he was definitely raised in the, affluent culture within the already generally affluent American culture, where, you know, I think all Americans, or I think anybody who earns above $30,000 a year, any household, is considered in the 1% of the entire globe. So we, you know, I read one of the founders of Google couldn't afford like a backpack, I think, when his dad sent him over here. Man, was that the right guy? Sergey Brin and Larry Page. No, maybe he wasn't the founder of Google. I didn't want to say it right, but I read about someone was sent over here, and his dad's salary was only enough to pay for like a backpack. So his dad's monthly salary, I think it was an Indian student I read about going to Harvard or something like that. But just like we forget the gross difference between the gap in wealth between first world countries and third world developing countries. And there's a huge disparity between countries, and when you're wealthy, it's like, how can you actually completely enjoy that without a little tinge, you know, being a little, once you're exposed to the complete desperation and poverty of other countries, it's hard to really fully enjoy that in a selfish way. Now, I feel like our minds are built to be able to compartmentalize things. That's how a lot of the, tragedies of in any war crime situation, any serious, I only was following orders type of situation happens. But anyways, I think David Foster Wallace's, he had a deep sense of depression. Obviously, he committed suicide. And I think it's important to learn from, you know, the fact that there are so many Robin Williams, you know, like so many successful or seemingly successful, outwardly materialistic, materially successful people that don't find enough meaning in life to be able to continue it. And the lessons there, I think, are invaluable. And I want to know the distinction between, I just opened a random article on Wikipedia about Maya Angelou, and well, not so random, it's definitely influenced by the current events, I'm sure. But, you know, a woman who grew up in the South during extreme racism and segregation, her one of the most famous poems is "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings." I want to know the difference between people who go through extraordinary, overwhelmingly just prejudiced oppressiveness in their lives, and yet they, you know, they don't come through unscathed. They actually are able to sublimate it, are able to internalize it and control the adversity and be able to use that energy to make a huge impact, to fuel their activities in the world, to communicate, to educate, to share their story, to come up with solutions. I guess on a more political level, that would be coming up with reforms and changes to institutions, institutional systems, infrastructures. On a more personal level, that would be, you know, writing, doing an act of creative expression, whether it's art, poetry, books, songs. But I'd like to know, like this, I feel like very, a little embarrassed I'm talking about this guy. I haven't even read his book, but I can't help but cringe at myself. But I want to know more about this guy's life and what led him to such despair after such material success, and clearly not, he didn't have personal success in his own self-development, in his own ability to grasp his, become who he was and take control of his own person. He didn't find any enough meaning in life to sustain his existence, and I don't think coincidentally, or I think it's very, I don't think it's a coincidence that he didn't have kids either. I think any great work of art, at least I'm fascinated by the idea, I don't think it, I've heard it, that art, truly profound, enduring art, is the expression of someone who's able to tap into a collective unconscious, a collective feeling, and, a collective, whether it's a sense of tragedy or a collective comedy, but, I think that's why Dave Chappelle is so great. He's able to be an extremely poignant observer. He's just so sharp and very able to, very, quick-witted, and he's very articulate, able to distill even the most tragic observations, like he did in his 846, his most recent special, and let us have a collective catharsis, a collective sigh of relief, a collective, when we collectively share in the acknowledgement of a extremely tragic occurrence, it's like a weight off our backs, because we're able to acknowledge it, and we're able to feel a part of a collective thought, almost. It's like we're all holding in this anxiety and stress about uncertainty on how to deal with seriously tragic situations, and Dave Chappelle was able to just acknowledge the, what would you call it? The opposite of fragility. Just our resilience, I guess. And Dave Chappelle just blasts us with some seriously tragic truths, yet he's able to adjust the tone in his voice, and on a dime he's able to quickly not shy away from the truth, but actually just veer and lean into it and point out the absurdity of certain situations. And I think just acknowledging reality lets us all relate to one another. I want to talk about this cruise ship article, because I just browsed through it. Maybe he did go on the cruise with someone else, but most of it appears to be just him by himself, making observations, doing as many activities as his finances allow, which I think he got a free trip to basically write a socially observational piece, just a raw, again, that's why I was comparing it to Dave Chappelle's, because he's it had me laughing out loud. The humor in it, it's just, he's so just unreserved in his observations that the funny part about it is that he's pointing out the absurdity of some of these almost childlike group activities that you get shuffled into and herded into on a already kind of childlike, very poor replacement, supplement for an adventure. A cruise ship, I think, at heart is trying to pander to people who aren't quite adventurous enough to go sailing across the seas, and I'm not one of them. I wouldn't do that, even though I have some small amount of experience on a boat, you know. But it's like, it's this sad, and I'm not getting political, I'm just saying it is a sad, it's like the sad part of capitalism, the decadent, the very selfish and childish and unadventurous, very uncourageous part of, you know, what you can buy. It's the marketing aspect of it is like, you know, there's a part of cruise ship marketing that panders to our sense of, our instinctive sense of, like I've been talking about a lot recently, adventure and exploration and curiosity, and it's just this very watered down, very bland, curated, manicured version of adventure. And then the decadence of endless buffets and you know, the superficiality of people showing off their bodies and just slathering themselves in suntan lotion. I mean, the whole essay is I'll just let it speak for itself, because it does, and it just sticks with you. It's a very sharp critique of the worst, you know, not the worst parts, but the most depressing parts of what we do with our money when we're just so compartmentalized that we don't recognize, you know, we have to not recognize all the tragedies in the world, or we would go crazy if we tried to understand all the cruel things that are happening to animals and people all around the world all the time. We gotta, in a real way, we have to, you know, only take reality in small, manageable doses, because that's how we can stay active, and keep moving forward. You know, like anything, you got to take it in small chunks. The largest, you know, 1,000-mile journey starts with the first step, and we don't want to, you know, paralyze ourselves with too much information at the start. So there is a huge benefit to compartmentalizing things, but it's like, this is delusion at its deepest. It's like, anyways, so I want to read this because I think it's a great example of, he was able to perceive why it is that cruise ships are so depressing. And of course, he, knowing what we now know about his tragic end, obviously brings a lot of bias to that perception, but it's also a famous article that got a lot of, you know, a lot of people were able to sympathize with the perspective that, especially, I think fundamentally, cruise ships can be made fun, you know, I mean, or else they wouldn't endure. Can't just be all gimmick and facade. There has to be some fun element in the completely hedonistic, over-drinking, overindulging, you know, just everything at your fingertips lifestyle, temporary lifestyle that you pay a lot for. I've been on a cruise ship once, and there's something there, but there's also an extremely profound sadness that you feel, if I can imagine, if you were by yourself, because I went with my family, and I'm sure it wasn't super cheap. It wasn't, you know, an elaborate, expensive cruise ship or anything, but I was by myself a lot of the cruise, because as one does when they go on family vacations with only their brother and sister and parents, and they're in their mid-teens and they want to be rebellious, but they're not of drinking age, so they have to sneak around a lot, and, you know, especially when you're going to Jamaica, there's a couple hoops you got to jump through to do interesting things, especially if you're by yourself. It is profoundly sad if you take a step back and think about you're paying all this money to go on a cruise and do very, very unadventurous, very tame, domesticated activities. So, but it's like great comedy. It comes out of deep. I think part of the interest in comedy is that the adventurousness of it is the fact that we are confronting reality. It's like there's a pride in not sugarcoating anything. There's a sense of meaning in recognizing like the horror of reality, or at least the darker side of reality, and it's something worth being proud about. I really took a took a long veering road on that tangent there. I think what I wanted to say was, sorry, I had to cut and get up and go to the bathroom real quick. Was that when we confront, it seems to be a psychological, but an actual therapeutic technique, that when we confront our fears willingly as opposed to unwillingly, which is like can induce, post-traumatic stress disorder. When you do it willingly, you grow an immunity to it that's like internal, like a psychological. You grow psychologically more formidable and robust, I guess. And I'm interested in that theory. And I really feel like it plays an integral part in very good comedy. I don't think it's all what all comedy is, but that's why most comedians, Kevin Hart always talks about how short he is. Like Eminem always talked about being white and in a primarily black activity in underground Detroit. Are they called ciphers? Freestyle groups and all that. And it's like you confront the elephant in the room, because then it doesn't control you. You have, even if it is a vice of yours, you at least are able to talk honestly about it. And that's where the theory, the idea of truth and leaning in rather than shying away from the truth is actually more powerful in the end. So it's just interesting to me, the whole concept of things being hilariously funny yet really tragic, that bittersweetness of it all at the same time. And that's why I want to read this article, and I might do this in 2 videos, because I don't know if I can sit and read. It's probably going to take me like 2 hours to read. But yeah, Infinite Jest, to give you an idea of like what his types of writing are, if you haven't read or heard of David Foster Wallace. Infinite Jest, again, it's 1,000 pages, but the main plot is that there's 4 interwoven narratives, and I don't want to give it all away, so these narratives they're connected via a film within the novel called Infinite Jest, also referred to as the entertainment or the samizdat, which is like an Eastern European word for like banned works of art, films, books, so forth, banned by the government. The film so entertaining to its viewers that they lose all interest in anything other than repeatedly viewing it, and thus eventually die. And this was the creator of the film in the novel. The guy's name was, the character's name was James Incandescence. I'm sure some sort of play on incandescent light bulbs. That was his final work. And of course, you know, in the big picture, if a film, no matter how funny, is fatal to its viewers, what does that tell you about its the you know, culture and society in which something like that would happen? A film being so funny and such a release of joy that people would rather rewatch it and risk, it's not specific, I haven't read the book, but maybe starvation, maybe laughter, death by laughter, or something like that, a heart attack, aneurysm. You know, what does that say about a culture that would pay so little mind to values of aesthetics and art and beauty and music, that a film comes along and infuses the lives of the viewers with so much meaning that they don't want to do anything else anymore. So that tells you that's a very industrial, mechanistic, individualist society, you know, and all this communist, anti-communist rhetoric. And it's, again, not a coincidence that this book was written in the early 90s, coming right out of the Cold War. And so David Foster Wallace was definitely a Gen Xer, a child of the Cold War, which I was born in '89, and I'd actually like to look into that more, just how crazy it is. I mean, it's kind of another example of how we compartmentalize things, but we, you know, we still have nukes, but it's not an actively tense situation between Russia and the U.S. anymore. It's turned into more of like an economic war zone, I guess. But that's probably just my over compartmentalization of it. I haven't done enough research to actually know what the likelihood of you know, nukes going off would be, but either way, I think there's a lot of merit in investigating and finding out about the actual value of truly great art, and, you know, whether that's books or music or whatever, because the stories in general, and this is where I'll probably end this, the stories in general, I'm convinced that enduring stories like, you know, Gilgamesh, great biblical stories, Eastern myths, you know, from the most ancient myths to the most popular modern art that we actually think might be enduring, you know, whether it's the archetypes, the hero, the you know, Mother Nature, Father Time, the Jester, the prodigal son, the deepest stories that involve the reoccurring themes using, you know, it's like each story, like George Lucas, when he wrote Star Wars, that's an enduring movie up until the last three. I really didn't like the Disney-fied, the last three, episodes 7 through 9. Let's see, archetypes. But George Lucas's renditions of the first three Star Wars that he did, episodes 4 through 6, he's admitted that he, was an English major, I think, for the most part, in college, and so he was very conscious of Joseph Campbell, who was a respected and a devoted student of Carl Jung, who himself was a proponent of the idea of psychological archetypes that are, he arrived at these through the comparative study of religions across the world. Jung, he acknowledged his conceptualization of the archetype is influenced by Plato's eidos, which he described as the formulated meaning of a primordial image by which it was represented symbolically. According to Jung, the term archetype is an explanatory paraphrase of the Platonic eidos, also believed to represent the word form. Let's get some clarification on what Jung's archetypes meant in particular, but the innocent, the orphan, the hero, the caregiver, those are ego types. Soul types, the explorer, the rebel, the lover, creator. Self types are the jester, the magician, sage, ruler. And it goes on and on and on and on. The liberator, rescuer. So, let's see what Jung said here. Jung's archetypes. His configuration are perhaps the most well known. There's the foundation of other models. Okay. On the deepest level, Jung's four major archetypes were the anima and animus, which are the kind of the opposite sex version, roughly speaking, within each individual. So males have female animas, females have male animuses, and they represent a because we, even aside from biology, I won't get into all this gender theory or anything, but in general we can all recognize that there are in fact very long traditions of cultural distinctions between males and females as far as their actual activities and roles with respect to societal things like raising children and working. I guess, what are the other big things? Household duties, external duties, just all the interrelations that happen within families. So, as a male, in other words, you get lopsided, you get biased to act more masculine. Females tend to act more feminine, generally, especially in regards to how thoroughly it's culturally enforced, like reinforced, like whether your parents, your mom teaches you to cook or, play soccer. And so you have this whole other side of the human experience that is the opposite sex, that all these actions and perceptions, even ways of viewing the world, that you wouldn't necessarily have developed to embody and act out. And so Jung thought that, for a male, he has a female anima within him that represents all the kind of typically more feminine perceptions of the world. That, if he's more stoic, the anima might be more sympathetic and empathetic, understanding. And if he's more, hardworking and just industrious, in a very non-creative way, in a very literal, mechanical, superficial, not very, non-creative way. The anima might be more, might think in more abstract terms. So it's kind of like a balance, in other words. So the more masculine you are, apparently, I think Jung thought, the more compelling your anima might be within you. The more outwardly masculine you are, the more unconsciously repressed your anima might be. And so that's, anyways, anima, animus. The other three are the self. This is kind of out of order if you're talking about layers of depth. There's obviously open to interpretation, but it's the persona, your outside, what you show to the world. And then, I forget whether it's the shadow or the anima and animus, or if you are trying to structure them in like a hierarchy of influence on your psyche. But then you got the shadow, the persona, anima and animus, the shadow, which is, a less gendered version of everything that you repress and you don't confront. Typically the more violent, instinctive, animal, repressed emotions and ways of viewing the world. And then finally, the self. The self, I'd love to, and I'm going to definitely do an episode on Jung's, on these four main archetypes that Jung formulated and expounded, propagated. But, anyways, these are the basis of the more, these are like the roots out of which, the foundation upon which, the more literary archetypes are built. We have, the ones I just mentioned, from the wise king to the tyrant. Those are balances of each other, to nurturing Mother Nature, to cruel, indifferent Mother Nature, and so on. So the hero is the one that Joseph Campbell chose to focus on most importantly, and that's what influenced George Lucas to invent the character of Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker. And I believe initially that's why he ended up making episodes 1 through 6, because I think he actually wrote the entire thing. If he didn't write all 6 as one story, he definitely wrote the first episodes 4 through 6 as one story initially, and then he realized that would be way too much information for one movie, so he broke it up into a trilogy. And Luke Skywalker was just a secondary character, being well, I actually don't know enough to elaborate more than that, but I know that Anakin, Darth Vader, was in fact the main character who, although Luke did need to be coaxed into, he did go through the hero's journey, the reluctant adventurer, and then confronting his demons in the form of Darth Vader, and then, assimilating his identity as a Jedi Knight and showing his courage. Ultimately, I think it was Darth Vader who was the fundamental main character of that. And so the point is that all these stories, they're retold using specifics from from within the context of the age in which they're written, and the current dilemmas, and so, ever since the industrialization, modernism, we've been obsessed with the idea of the machine and the mechanisms, and being cogs in a wheel is a very deep, well, not super deep, but it's a very contemporary symbol of slavery to us. And so that's why we have movies like The Matrix, and symbolism created in 1980 in the movie, the novel 1984, back in 1948, which was written right after the atomic bomb was dropped. So it's, the last 100 years of history is very driven by the fear of just becoming robots, essentially, and playthings of robots, or artificial intelligence, as we get ever nearer to a less mechanical and more electronic technologies in general, and in the widespread culture. Modernism is, it's a philosophical and artistic movement that arose from the broad transformations in Western society during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the rise of these massive businesses, like, steel companies, these huge magnates, Carnegie, Rockefeller, these oil, steel, all these other industrial companies, these railroads, the mass laying of railroads, just everything became very industrialized, and our fear was hyper-industrialization. We felt, people were ever increasingly becoming the playthings, or I don't want to say, I don't want to look back, sorry for the traffic, with rose-colored glasses, but because we were always we were the cannon fodder, we meaning non-wealthy people in any era. We were either the slaves or the labor class, and up until the last king was on the front lines in battle in definitely the Middle Ages. I don't think it was beyond that, because no Western leader in the last couple hundred years has definitely not been on the front lines. Maybe Napoleon, maybe that's why he's so revered. He had boots on the ground, so to speak. But anyways, that was a collective fear that we're going to be sucked in, and any creativity or meaning that we could find in our lives would have been absorbed by the necessity of all our intelligences being directed towards a bigger government, socialist, monopolistic political machine, something any individual didn't have any power in. And that's why the death of the individual is a huge fear in postmodernism. And I think that's what has its roots in modernism in general. And that's what David Foster Wallace was, that ennui, which is a sense of dread, which, does he talk about that in there? Maybe he does. Yeah, I think he does. So, anyways, this yeah, he was just like his whole character, and anybody who's familiar with him or is just an English major in general who knows more than I do is probably really, well, probably tuned out a long time ago, clicked away from this video. But my understanding of it, again, is just that he's a very upset in a deep way, not upset in a superficial, didn't get his ice cream kind of way, but like can't find a story that he can collectively take part in, that he truly believes in. You know, that's part of the bigger picture of the West, facing the destruction of religion, which was a very coherent, it aligned everyone in society with a common origin story and a common conception of what's good and what's bad. There's heaven and hell. You want to avoid this and move towards this. We're all subservient to God, not any one individual, which can take power and become a tyrant. You know, there's these deep philosophical concepts, these religious concepts that for thousands of years held, you know, Western civilization, and even further back held Egypt, Sumerians together, with the concept of, you know, these deeply symbolic concepts like dying and being reborn again with the help of the person who has a vision to be able to stay current with current affairs, to be able to recognize when to recognize shifts in technologies and cultures and art and adjust the bigger machine so that it doesn't get stagnant and stay stuck in the past. And it's like these ideas are fundamental, and I think that's why the archetype of the hero is so, it's so widespread, I guess, so potent, is because we all, whether we realize it or not, recognize that regardless of how big any one movement, regardless of how big any one movement is, or how justified it might be, a physical movement in the actual world always has the possibility, a physical institution that, you know, a single or group of people can occupy, always has the possibility of being occupied eventually by a group of corrupt people. And therefore, you know, the political aims, or the just the aims in general of the institution, always has the possibility of going corrupt, which is why the founders, the writers of the U.S. Constitution, were pretty smart in saying, we only want a temporary, limited number of terms for the president. And George Washington was apparently going to be made king of America, and turned it down because it would have exposed, it would have opened up the entire thing that he had just fought for, the nation of the U.S., to be possibly corrupted and tyrannized over if the wrong person got into that position at some point. So, you know, we have to recognize that a system is bigger than any one individual, and therefore, you know, ideas like something about each individual makes them, privileges them with the right to exist, to, you know, get a fair trial, to not be treated like less than humans, regardless of how they look, and alternately does not allow any individual, no matter how many material possessions he has and how many people are on his payroll, to physically harm or create genocide on any group of people, for any reason. There's these ideas, like at the Geneva Convention, that regardless of the violence and the ultimate character of death that plagues actual wars, it's agreed upon among nations after World War, was it one, that there are certain actions that you can't do. You know, still sometimes done, but attention of powers that allows for the murder, the mass murder in the form of war. There's certain types of murder, certain ways to murder that are banned. So it's it's part of this ongoing process to figure out exactly what the most harmonious way to for humans to coexist on a mass scale, given the fact that we're on the order of billions, 7 billion people in the world now. So man, where was I trying to go is the real question. I think my jumping off point was that stories in general, it was to try to just comment briefly on the value of stories in terms of their relationship with values of easier to agree upon facts like science yields. Elon Musk, NASA, a couple other institutions are able to build an extremely, almost, well, for me, incomprehensibly complex rocket, a bullet-shaped thing with explosive, very combustible materials, but designed within a manifold that allows the control, the precise control of the direction and mostly output of these bombs, essentially. So it's like there's rockets strapped to bombs, but the math, the physics, the careful measurement and distillation of these eternal characteristics of space and time have been formulated into equations and formulas, and as far as we know, those formulas are very precise and they're irrefutable. Now, interestingly, Newton, so something we got to be skeptical of is how accurate Einstein's version of reality is, which is our most contemporary version of reality, roughly speaking, of how, essentially how gravity works. Because Einstein was an alteration of Newton for 300 years. We thought Newton had essentially figured out reality. He discovered that things moved in a gravitational field. Like, I don't know if did Newton conceive it as a field, or was that more of like an Einsteinian thing? But he was able to calculate, he was able to come up with equations that allowed the calculation, the very, very, very precise calculation of trajectories of objects, like we've done once or twice on this channel, given the fact that he recognized through very careful observation objects, in whether thrown directly up, dropped, thrown in parabolic arcs, they reacted as though they were under the control of a force, and that force always remained constant. And it in a vacuum. That's why a feather and a bowling ball can be dropped in a vacuum with no air, in a chamber that has no air in it. On the moon, they demonstrated it with a feather and a hammer, I believe. So there's no resistance, no air resistance, keeping the feather from just falling straight. When there's air particles, the reason the feather exists in the shape that it does is precisely because it does capture, it has the widest surface area for the amount of mass that goes into making, for the number of atoms, I guess you might say, in the feather. So it's designed in a way, if you will, to capture and resist gravity's fall. But when you take away the air that it's designed to float aerodynamically upon, it falls just as fast as the bowling ball. So there's these truths like that. And then Einstein came and Newton discovered these, and a lot of other things too. And for 300 years we thought that was the end-all be-all. And then Einstein came and was investigating electricity and atomic movement and acceleration, and decided that it's weird that gravity acts as though you're being accelerated. And he actually, no, I can't riff off the top of my head exactly what Einstein's train of thought was to arrive at E equals mc squared, but obviously we all know relativity was the fundamental perception, conceptual breakthrough, I guess. And Einstein's thought ultimately led to a much more, just a larger, more encompassing picture of how space reacts with, how objects react with other objects, particularly massive objects like stars and planets in space, and how he was able to conceive that, when objects are massive enough, their effects on the trajectories of objects become apparent enough that they actually slow down what we think of as time. And that's what's crazy. It's like both movement and gravity affect the concept of time. So time changes, like in Interstellar. That's why it was such a cool movie in part, because time changes around a black hole, which is a singularity. It's where so much mass is packed into such a tiny volume space that the atoms can no longer remain separate, and they collapse into multiple atoms occupy the same point in space. Everything we know, which goes against everything we know, because nothing we know of exists, that we, here on Earth at least, where two atoms occupy the exact same position in space. They're always next to each other. They always have their own distinct area of space. And so Einstein's conception of relativity and E equals mc squared and space-time ended up being a larger, more real truth, in which Newton's conception of physics fit as a as just a, what do you call it, just a particular type of case that exists in a particular set of circumstances, where the gravity, when objects aren't that massive. Our sun's a relatively average-sized star, and I realize I'm just rambling hopelessly at this point, but because Earth isn't that big, the sun isn't all that big, and so they don't produce all that much gravity relative to larger things like supermassive black holes and, Betelgeuse, massive stars, our little corner of the neighborhood doesn't really experience that much relativistic alteration of effects. And so Newton's conception was based on our local solar system, in which we didn't see any exceptionally radical changes in the behavior of time and light, being radically distorted by massive gravitational fields, and we didn't see relativistic effects that much. It turns out that the orbit of Mercury, because it's so close to the sun and is thus much more in control, much more thoroughly controlled by the sun's gravitational field, did have an unexplained pattern. The orbit of Mercury was not able to be completely explained, unlike the other planets, by Newton's predictions. And it turns out that Einstein, that was one of the defining, it's one of the things that confirmed Einstein's equations accurately predicted. Einstein's equations accurately represented reality was because he succeeded, his equations, his view of reality in terms of physics and mathematics, succeeded where Newton's view and equations had failed. So Einstein was able to radically shift our paradigm of what we thought of as reality using intuition, interestingly enough, which is a whole nother topic I want to get into, Ramanujan, and just the idea that many of the scientific breakthroughs we think we know, like the structure of DNA, the periodic table of elements, there's actually a lot, like a kind of unsettling number of what we think of as the pinnacle of rational reasoning and thought that actually arose out of dreams and intuitions and visions, and many of which were had religious overtones or undertones. I actually just looked at, I don't know the difference between those two words, but they were religiously infused. If not specifically a particular religion, they had elements of a spiritual communication to them, something divine about them. So I guess this has just been one off the cuff kind of way for me to make a point about the mysteriousness of what we consider truth, ultimately, because science has given us a lot of facts about the world, and interestingly, facts that have a lot to do with how we move through the world, as far as, helping us get through the world faster and control things electromagnetically, like cars and computers and airplanes and telecommunications. So there's a ton of areas of the world we haven't chosen to study just because they don't have any relevance to our human lives. So there's that aspect. And I guess I want to say, this is my really amateur attempt to make a case, like I'm always kind of subtly trying to figure out, not against science. I'm actually a huge proponent of the scientific method. I just think that the human experience and consciousness in particular is yet to be properly accounted for by science alone. So stories, that's where stories come in, and that's where David Foster Wallace, for me, is interesting, because he found, I think, the most meaning in his life by telling stories and making observations that he, yeah, I'm definitely not going to read this today. My voice is kind of going out, if you hadn't figured that out by now. But like in this example of the cruise ship, what the hell is it called, shipping out article, he makes observations that are funny, and he almost doesn't even know why they're funny. He just has, and I know this because I've been listening to a ton of his interviews, and in the interviews he often is asked, like, what are your, thoughts about your writing, or this and that aspects of how you write, or what you wrote, or your technique. And he often says, like, in the way of someone who, to me, it seems, just has read and absorbed and so much writing, and then himself written so much, he often responds in a way that it seems he just thinks it's more of intuition that he uses. In other words, you're not just born with an intuition of how to write a great novel, a 1,000-page novel, Infinite Jest. You internalize it, and you make the most important features of telling a good story, a lot of which are the archetypal things that are elements of stories that reoccur and occur, by just absorbing, exposing yourself to, and reading the best works, as many works as you can, and then of course writing, because the act of writing solidifies certain ideas and dismisses other ideas. Especially when you write bad things and you go back and re-edit them or just reread them, you recognize immediately what to keep and what is trash. And there's operations, conscious operations, on levels that are go beyond. Well, there's mental operations, I should say, that on levels that go beyond consciousness. And so, yes, he's conscious of the subjects and the actions of those subjects, and the broader narrative arc that his characters undergo. But at the same time, he's infusing a lot of his own experience and the symbols and imagery and situations of things he hasn't personally experienced, things he's read about or been told, or even more deeper mythological ideas that he studied. In the hero's journey, there's always the, I find when I'm watching movies, reading books, if characters don't, that's kind of why it's like Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm is, I can only take that in small doses, because it's funny, because it does confront like a sad, tragic reality. Again, a good element of comedy is just being brutally honest about a cringy, if it's not deep, it's just cringy, but if it's really deep, I guess humor, it's more tragic in a deep way. But his is like, it's a little too meaningless, the realities he's confronting, which are just the realities, the observations of a very wealthy, particularly Jewish, because he does emphasize his Jewishness a lot. All his main friends are all Jewish. Reality, like this very affluent, kind of elite. I mean, the guy's probably almost worth $1 billion now based on Seinfeld, his writer career on Seinfeld, and his acting, writing career on Curb Your Enthusiasm. And it's like too trivial and too, it's kind of cowardly, you know. That's what he leans into, is his own failure to confront preemptively awkward situations. He lets the situation get awkward and avoids confronting it, kicking and screaming, you know, and or I guess until he's dragged kicking and screaming into having to deal with oftentimes the situation that he himself caused, you know, whether it's a very selfish move, you know, stealing a parking spot. I don't know. That's what the nature of Curb Your Enthusiasm is. So it's a series of like very uninteresting, very unadventurous, very small and petty struggles with other people in the larger backdrop of a very wealthy neighborhood, you know, in Hollywood, California-ish area. It's like his struggles aren't the deep battles between good and evil that are going to determine the ultimate fate of humanity, in other words. So there are levels of, you know, things, there are reasons things endure in stories like Gilgamesh and you know, again, all the deep mythological stories. The reasons they endure are because they speak about truths that are perennial to the human condition. They're always there. They're always things that every human being confronts within themselves, oftentimes. So it's not only informative about how to interact with other people. You know, you have the Ten Commandments, which is very explicit, but you also have, you know, the story of Genesis, which is like the bittersweetness of acknowledging your mortality by biting into the apple and having the power of foresight that you know you're going to die, so that in a way infuses your life with meaning, because now you recognize and you have the knowledge, the very valuable knowledge, that you are mortal and you have a finite time. So you have knowledge of reality, something that is inevitable. You know, it's one definition of reality, something that is unavoidable. And so therefore you have the upper hand in the sense of someone relative to someone who did not have knowledge of that, or did not have intimate knowledge of it enough to take it seriously and do something to you know, establish a legacy, you know, do something that maybe might help their generations down the line, make their life more meaningful, make a little less suffering for some people. And I think I'm just interested in David Foster Wallace because he obviously in the end lost the battle against his own dread of his own battle with the meaninglessness of a wide variety of aspects of the contemporary American life. And I think he didn't find enough hope and didn't find enough value in what America was in relation to the world. It seems This is a lot of projection here, but I bet, you know, he got married like twice. One of his wives, he like was very. It didn't seem like he was very. It's crazy because he was a piercing observationalist, observer of reality, and that's why his writings are so good. And it's because he's able to point out truths about reality and social experiences in a way that not only does he see them, but he's able to write about them in a very interesting way and make them easy to read, and which is a whole nother art in itself. But it's like he didn't know how to navigate a relationship properly. It doesn't seem, which isn't an easy thing to do. It's just, you know, he ended up, I don't think he had kids. I bet that would have given his life a lot more meaning, because when you have kids, it seems to me, I'm not there yet, but I would like to, you have more skin in the game, so to speak. You have a life that you're entirely responsible for, and you therefore have just put all your cards on the table as far as what to do with your life. You no longer have the option, at least in any noble sense, of just bowing out of the game and letting humanity, other humans, due to the broad culture of humanity or civilization as we know it, you know, what they will. You are, once you have kids, you've established it's kind of like you've established some psychic territory and physical territory on the broad stage, as it were. Again, another interesting thing is that we look at the world's a stage, as Shakespeare said often. And we think of wars, though the most serious, impactful things, as far as oftentimes, or at least up until now, as far as impacting the trajectory of human history. We think of those, historians write volumes on the theaters of war in World War II, the European theater or the Pacific theater. And, you know, we think in terms of stories and narratives. And once you have children, it's like you're writing a new chapter in your book. And you're preventing your story from closing decisively when you die. You now at least have the hope or the potential that your story, even if it's only the spirit of your story, and you know, even if in 100 years nobody living actually remembers you physically, they don't have any active memories of you, they might have memories of your son or daughter, and the things they remember about them will be the characteristics and the traits and the mannerisms and the behaviors that you passed on to them. And who knows how far back some of our behaviors actually are traceable. You know, or not traceable, but if we were to have the knowledge, how far back we might be able to say this particular set of, you know, cultural values or behaviors actually goes into history. And it's just, yeah, that's why I'm fascinated by psychology, by history, because just as important as the physical bodies that, you know, become political figures and great artists and, you know, the people who were integral in shaping the industrial age and inventors and tradesmen who were integral in building cathedrals and colosseums and all that, are the ideas that these people, broad groups of people, inhabit or the people, the broad groups of people that these ideas inhabit, maybe might be the better way of talking about it. So, how do I want to wrap this up? Yeah, I don't know. I just want to, I guess I just value stories as a way to mine for truths. And this story in particular it just resonated with me. It made me laugh in like a real guttural way. Like I was reading it, I was practicing reading it earlier, and I couldn't help myself. Like, couldn't help but stop reading because I had to laugh. I couldn't keep a straight face. And it's just comical, the fact that this is real, and the fact that this guy, some of the characters he encounters on board this cruise ship are so just not real. It's interesting. Like it's so relatable because it's sad, but there's so many people in reality that are so unaware of how superficial they come across as, who are just so blatantly selfish and absorbed with their own appearances, that you gotta laugh at it. So yeah, I guess I just want to pay my respects to the value of good comedy, writing or speech, stand-up. I don't want to get into anything political, but I do appreciate Dave Chappelle's stand-up, because if we can't laugh about things, if we can't talk about things, we can't laugh about things, and we can't confront the realities, the sad and harsh truths that are necessary to have communicated in order to be able to take action. Because we can't effectively change laws and change how certain types of people behave unless we're dealing with the reality and the facts at hand. And I say effectively because we can change how people behave, but they're going to be ultimately ineffective, corrupt, or just extremely negative for the life, the quality of life for people and civilizations in general, if the ways we're making people change their behavior is based on lies or half-truths. And if we can't laugh at the sadness, the hidden depression beneath the waves upon which these luxury cruises often sail, we can't give the next generation something to look forward to. We can't alter history so that it's a little bit better for the next generation instead of worse, because it can certainly always get worse, but it can always get better too. So that's the eternal battle. So I guess that's the eternal battle between good and evil I was talking about earlier, referencing at least. As much as we can learn from people who failed, we can also learn a lot from people who have succeeded. And this guy did both. I think he failed to overcome his profound dissatisfaction with how he failed to be emotionally satisfied with his actions in life enough to sustain his existence, really. You know, I want to know why, like where he went wrong. He's such an interesting guy, and his thoughts were his thoughts, and he was just so perceptive. He was very, very intelligent, and it seemed like he was emotionally very, very vulnerable, I guess. And I think as the internet, maybe I'm particularly sensitive to that because I appreciate the vulnerability. I guess that's why I kind of use you guys as my shrink. It seems like that's something we all desperately need, and it does seem like it's a trajectory the cultural, like online culture, is generally trending towards. People want less filtered, they want more raw, they want reality, you know? And we're never going to get anywhere unless we confront reality willingly, with open eyes, and with a clear sense of what is good and what is bad. And I think something as hilariously depressing as this story, to me, is very educational in terms of figuring out what to avoid. What types of people are just what types of lifestyles, rather, and the people who these lifestyles cater to are just clearly not the right way to go about living your life, especially if you have the amount of money that the people in this story have, you know? So I think, you know, part of our path in the future is recognizing, like the big movement of recognizing our privilege, is to broaden that conception and recognize our national privilege on the world stage, as it were, and recognize that once we're able to take care of our own, we need to, and we do, it's not like we don't do humanitarian efforts, and it's not like there's plenty of very, very, it seems altruistic billionaires out there. Maybe not plenty, but there's not a complete absence of them, I think. So anyways, our I think it's interesting. I think it's intrinsically interesting. And I think the mark of a good storyteller is one who is able to make us laugh when confronted, in the midst of confronting and showing us despair, and who's able to make us cackle with laughter while showing the most bleak realities. And this guy seems like one of them. So I'd like to absorb his, you know, what he left in the world, I think. And this story seems like one of them. One of the great, you know, nuggets of insights, even if it's not distilled into a pithy aphorism that we can quote. I think the general story of this is it's a good criticism of you know, the decadence and the what not to do when you have wealth, or at least what we generally want to avoid as as a trap we might fall into when considering what fun really is. Again, the subtitle is on the nearly lethal comforts of a luxury cruise. The subtext, I think the subtext of that being the lethality ultimately for him. It's not very it's not unique for artists to predict their own deaths and to often, like, you know, cry for help in a serious way. Famous artists did that all the time. Sublime in general has a song called Pool Shark, in which he writes about one day losing the war to heroin, which he did. And on the nearly lethal comforts of a luxury cruise. I think he wrote that subtitle, Shipping Out. I think he wrote the whole title, the whole thing, with a very conscious eye at the broader culture that this particular trip on a cruise ship is just a part of, just one facet of. And if we stay on our comfortable comforts is a key word there. If we stay on the comforts that our privilege provides, without recognizing how immensely wealthy we are, and in how immensely grateful we should be, without recognizing the losses and sacrifices throughout centuries that have allowed the current affluence of, particularly in America. This guy was an American, and the ship is right out of Key West, Florida, my own state. He recognizes, in the title, the nearly lethal comforts of a luxury cruise is very indicative of what meaninglessness can arise out of avoiding true adventure in lieu of or going on a cruise and going on the sad, facade of an adventure in lieu of a real adventure, going out and, learning some history, educating yourself as much as possible, just using every avenue of education and self-education, whether in books or on the streets or in institutions, whether it's politics or local businesses or, local politics, national politics, learning about the environment, learning about astronomy, our larger environment. There's so many facets of life yet to explore in a real meaningful way, and there's so much that goes uncommunicated back. Even once people do learn, there's so much interesting, useful, perspective-altering information that needs to be relayed and injected back into the community. That going on a decadent, hedonistic, comfortable cruise, and I'm not knocking it if we're literally talking about a cruise and you've earned it and you want to just chill out and get hammered and eat a bunch of food and watch comedy shows and lounge on the deck for a week, that's fine. But if you act like that throughout your whole life, if you make that the goal of life, his point is there's no meaning to be found that's going to prevent it from being perhaps more than nearly lethal in the end. So, David Foster Wallace shipping out on the nearly lethal, I can't say that word, on the nearly lethal comforts of a luxury cruise is what we'll be reading. Probably not today, but soon. So I hope I do it. Now I've talked a big game. I'm gonna put this out probably as a podcast, maybe as a video, because it's probably gonna be a pretty boring video, but definitely a podcast. And hopefully you guys like it. And we'll be back to the regularly astronomy-based, more historical material episodes soon. So until then, I'll see you guys next time. But until then, have a good day, good night. Stay well, stay healthy. And I'd be a hypocrite if I told you to do anything more than that. Thanks for watching, guys, or listening. Bye.
I mean, I hear a brain at work there. Sort of, where do you want it to go? What is it?
I think not exploding would be a nice start. That kind of stuff, I dissociate very well, and it's a useful talent. Part of you is a nerd, and you want to sit in libraries, you don't want to be bothered, and you're very shy, and another part of you is the worst ham of all time. Look at me, look at me, look at me, and you have fantasies about writing something that makes everybody drop to one knee, you know. Feminists are always saying this. So feminists are saying white males have, okay, I'm going to sit down and write this enormous book and impose my phallus on the consciousness of the world.
And you say?
If that was going on, it was going on at a level of awareness I do not want to have access to. That what the really great artists do, and it sounds very trite to say it out loud, well, what the really great artists do is they're entirely themselves. They're entirely themselves. They've got their own vision, their own way of fracturing reality, and that if it's authentic and true, you will feel it in your nerve endings. And this is what Blue Velvet did for me. If you wanted something like really exciting or sexy, there really isn't much. I just got really
unhappy. But were you, I mean, it was drugs and you were suicidal and the whole 9 yards, yes?
Yeah, here's why I'm embarrassed talking about it. Not because I'm personally ashamed of it, but because everybody talks about it. I did some recreational drugs. I didn't have the stomach to drink very much, and I didn't have the nervous system to do anything very hard. That wasn't the problem. The problem was I started out, I think, wanting to be a writer and wanting to get some attention, and I got it really quick. And
by writing?
And realized it didn't make me happy at all, in which case, why am I writing? You know, what's the purpose of this? And I don't think it's substantively different from the sort of thing, you know, somebody who wants to be a really successful cost accountant, right, and be a partner of his accounting firm and achieves that at 50 and goes into something like a depression. The brass ring I've been chasing does not make everything okay. So that's why I'm embarrassed to talk about it. It's just not particularly interesting. It's what it is very, very average. And it wasn't a whole lot of attention, but it seemed like a whole lot to, you know, a library weenie from the lower level of Frost Library at Amherst College. And I had a hard time with it. And I was lucky enough to have a really hard time with it at an age early enough so that there was something left in my life when it was over.